My name is Molly Keck, if you guys don't know me.
Yeah.
There we go. Sorry, I unmuted everyone instead of muting everybody. And David Rodriguez, our horticulturalist, and I kind of came up with some paired presentations or webinars that we wanted to provide to everybody who might be home and bored and craving something to do or someone to listen to. And so I'm going to cover what native pollinators are out here right now, but David, tomorrow, hopefully you can log back on to check it out. He's going to be covering the native pollinators that are found. I'm sorry, he's going to be covering what plants you can plant. And he's a horticulturalist, so if you're really into native plants, not every single plant that he's going to speak about is going to necessarily be native. But a good chunk of them you probably can still appreciate and like. So, you know, what is a native pollinator? I guess you could think of it in two ways. When I'm thinking of a native pollinator, I'm thinking of those guys that are indigenous to this area that are pollinating plants. Whether those plants are native or not is kind of outside my wheelhouse because I just really know bugs, right? When these insects are pollinating, they're going to the flower, they're touching those sex organs, and then they're visiting other flowers. And their bodies usually have a lot of fuzz or grooves and maybe scales on them. Like in the case of butterflies, of course, they have lots of scales. That's what leaves that soot on your hands after you've touched one. And that's what makes them really good pollinators, is just having the body that allows them to pick up the pollen, and it just sprinkles off from one thing to the other. Most of the things that do pollinate are insects. About 90% of flowering plants have to have something that pollinates them. About 90% of flowering plants rely on something to pollinate them for fertilization. So, and those guys contribute about $15 billion annually to crop yield. I'll mention honeybees a little bit later on, but just to mention them right off the bat, honeybees really are better at pollinating food crops. And we have a lot of native bees and other native pollinators that are out there that are actually a lot better at pollinating the fauna that you just see, the fauna, actually the flora, I guess, that's out there in your landscape. So a lot of people, of the about 200,000 species of animals that pollinate, only 1,000 of those are not an insect. So that's pretty significant, I think, because we always, you know, people who really love birds and hummingbirds and things like that, maybe don't like to give insects a lot of the credit, but there's a reason why they get all the credit. It's because they just do a better job of pollinating than other things do. And there's a good number of different things that pollinate. We're really not going to talk moths or butterflies because that's a whole other presentation that I could do. And as I was putting this together, I thought to myself, actually, that's a really good idea for me to do a little bit later on. But there's so many things that are pollinators that you probably wouldn't recognize as being a pollinator, that might look like nothing like a bee or a wasp or things that you think of as being a pollinator. But even flies and beetles, and I'll show you some pictures of what all those guys are a little bit later on. What I think is so interesting about pollinators is that they're actually very selfish about what they pollinate. When they go to a flower, they're going for one of two reasons. If it's a bee, or there's something that has to produce offspring, or that is trying to feed their offspring, they are trying to go after for pollen, because pollen is the protein. Things like butterflies and moths are really going after the plants for nectar. So in reality, they're kind of not really a great pollinator, but I always like to say they're kind of like the gateway pollinator, because they get people to be interested in other pollinators and get excited about them. But nectar is basically the sugar, it's the carb. So bees are going after, bees and wasps are going after the flowers for both pollen and nectar, because they need a mix of both. They also have those little chewing mouth parts. A butterfly, of course, doesn't. So all he can go after that flower for is for that liquid food. And they're super selfish about the food that they pick up. So they don't want to share that with anybody if they can help it. They would much rather take it back to their nest and share it with their offspring. And so it's just accident. It's just Mother Nature and evolution and adaptations that have allowed those insects to have the ability to kind of suck up the pollen on their fuzzy little bodies and then drop it off as they bounce from flower to flower. So it's kind of like pixie dust. But they're not pollinating on purpose. They're pollinating as an accident. And it just blows my mind that they still do such a good and important job at pollinating, even though it's not on purpose. Mother Nature to me is kind of an amazing thing. There's a whole lot of native bees that are out there, and then many of them don't even look like bees. A lot of them are kind of metallic in color. Some of them almost can mimic flies, I'm sorry. There's about 4,000 species in North America. We have not quite 4,000, but we have a good chunk here just in Texas. And a lot of those guys are actually better at pollinating certain plants that we really appreciate. Like the big one here in San Antonio area or in Texas in general, I think is tomatoes, right? Because everybody loves their tomatoes. And really most of the things that are blooming in your veggie garden right now are not going to be pollinated by a honeybee, but by a native bee instead. So they definitely play a very important role in what we consume and what we grow in our landscape. Here's just another picture of them to kind of show you. Sometimes they look like they could be as big as like a hornet, and sometimes they look like little metallic colored wasps. The big difference, if you're wondering, between a wasp and a bee is that a bee is generally hairy and fuzzy. So even though these guys may be way up at the top, I know my pointer is kind of small, but these guys way up at the top are metallic. They still have a lot of fuzz on their body, and being fuzzy is really the thing that makes them good at what they do. Bumblebees are, by and large, I would say my favorite native bee. There's 46 species in North America, and I want to say we have 30 something of those. That could be a complete lie. Somebody might know better than I do. There is a way to identify what your bumblebee is. Texas Parks and Wildlife has a really good key that you can probably print out yourself now. I have one in my office that's like a little poster, but you can actually look at the markings of the striping of white and white and black, and that can tell you what species you have. The problem with those bumblebees, though, is that key is usually for the females. And like for me, whenever I take a picture of one, it's inevitably a male. So I never can actually tell what species it probably is. But if you get lucky, you should be able to catch them. So bumblebees are pretty cool because they do produce honey, but it's just not enough for us to steal from them. Generally, they nest in the ground, and this is kind of their life cycle. So right now, these guys are, if you're seeing a bumblebee on plants right now, chances are it's a female. So the nest is initiated by a female queen who overwinters. So she spends the winter time, she's already mated, and she's living deep in the ground. And when spring comes around, she emerges from her nest, and she'll start foraging for her own food and seeking a new and a good nesting site. Eventually, because she's already been mated, she will lay eggs, and she will make all of those, she will feed all of those babies herself. And once those babies grow and become adults, then that's when the population really rises, and the workers start to take over, and they take care of the queen, and she doesn't do anything anymore. So these guys are semi-social. They're not completely social. If they were a truly social insect, they would live through the winter time and never die off, kind of like a honeybee colony is always there. So they're considered semi or quasi-social. They do kind of have a caste system, but it's kind of like a loose caste system. It's not like specific jobs that everybody has. And so their populations are going to be pretty high a little bit later on. So if you see one flying around, you've got a queen, probably most likely. And I just think they're really cool, beautiful bees. They say they do something that they do the impossible every single day, which is fly, because their body is so fat that they can't actually, they shouldn't be able to fly physically, but they do. So this is kind of a close-up of what that nest looks like if you were to kind of peel away the grass or whatever it is that they happen to be nesting in. They tend to live in the ground. You'll also find them in old stumps. So if you have an old stump outside in your backyard and it doesn't bother you, leave it there, because they will definitely start to nest in there. And once they've nested in there once, they tend to come back. But I've also seen people who will say that they find them in like empty birdhouses or other kind of voids. They'll start to kind of fill it up. And it's just kind of a weird looking little nest there. They are semi-social, but they also like company. So usually where you find one nest, you'll find many, many more. we do know that their populations have declined somewhat. And this is probably due to a number of things. More than anything, it's probably going to be due to the fact that their habitat has gone away. So we don't really have pastures and prairies and meadow type fields anymore. We are planting things, we're farming this land, but we're also building our houses, in the neighborhood and on those lands. There is a Bumblebee Watch citizen science project if you're interested in that. It's bumblebeewatch.org, and so you can snap pictures of your bumblebees and it will upload. And this is important. These citizen science projects, I think, are very important because they allow people who are doing research on these insects to know where the populations are found. And maybe you will find the last species of a certain type of bumblebee in your yard, and you become famous for it, and they know that you have a great habitat for them. So those are kind of cool things to be a part of if you would like to be. So on that same note, I hear and see all the time on social media that bumblebees and bees are declining, or that they're going extinct, or they're on the endangered species list. In reality, the only North American bumblebee that's been listed on the Endangered Species Act is this rusty patch bumblebee. So thankfully in Texas, we are far away from that. Although we do know that our populations are somewhat declining. We tend to be later on catching up to bad things that happen than the rest of the world does. I guess because we have a little bit more land and it's going to take longer for us to fill up all that land maybe. But these guys are found in the upper Midwest mainly, and I think even up into Canada. But they're not something we've ever had here, so it's nothing that we've done to hurt them. I think that bumblebees are certainly worth conserving. They are excellent pollinators. They are even able to fly when there's when it's raining. So even on rainy days, bees go away, but bumblebees are out there. They're cowboys. They do whatever they want to do. Whenever you plant anything that flowers, you're going to bring bumblebees in. They love color. And anything that flowers will bring them in if they're around. If you live in a really densely populated area, maybe it's harder for them to make their way there because maybe there's not that many nesting habitats. But ways that you can provide habitats for them would be just leave some land uncultivated if you can, or put in hedgerows. They like to nest where the roots meet the soil because it's kind of really pliable for them to kind of build that little nest. And again, with those old tree stumps, if you have them, then leave them there, and I bet you the bees will come back over and over again. So bumblebees are really, and there's probably other species, but bumblebees are really the big ones that are native, the big ones that are native and social. There's a lot of solitary bees, and solitary bees will not sting you because they don't have a home to defend. Bees or any social insect, think of even ants, right, for how mean fire ants are. If they're defending their house, then they are at their meanest. They're at their most aggressive. So solitary bees don't have a home to defend, and they're not going to be really aggressive. And these are ones that you can manage in a way in your yard without actually truly being worried about getting stung by them. So mason bees are one of those solitary bees. What's interesting about these guys is that they carry their food on the pollen on their belly instead of on their little thighs. So if you see something visiting a flower and their belly is full of yellow pollen, you can impress your friends and tell them that it is it's a mason bee. So what they do is they find cylinders that they like to fill. And this could be like the empty shaft of a plant or something. It could be bamboo. It could be a hose. It could be patio furniture, a number of different things. They will fill it and take mud and almost insulate the inside of that mud. Insulate the inside of that tube, and then they'll lay their eggs inside of those spots. And they will gather nectar and pollen and make like a bee ball or a pollen ball. And they will lay their egg on top of that little ball. And when the baby hatches, it's provisioned with its own food. So if mom dies, she doesn't have to feed them. She leaves them with enough food to make it through their life cycle. And so if in this tube, she would start on the furthest end, she'd lay an egg, or she'd roll her little ball in there, lay an egg, and then she would close it up, and then she'd do it again. And so when they emerge, they all kind of crawl out of that little hole together. Usually she'll do about 5 to 8, and they always emerge next spring. So around this time, if you're seeing some mason bees, what you're seeing are these guys emerging out of their little tubes. Leaf-cutting bees will do the same thing. Not every species of these guys is a pollinator, but a good number of these guys are. And not every species of leaf-cutting bee, or what is considered a leaf-cutting bee, at least in the family of leaf-cutting bees, will necessarily cut leaves. If you have, I haven't seen any active because I walked around and tried to get some leaves for you guys to show, but they're emerging right now, or will be emerging very soon. And if you walk around your landscape, and this is very true for roses, they tend to love to do it to roses, it will cut like a perfect 3/4 circle almost around the leaf. And it's like someone came and they like popped it with a hole punch or something. They will take those cuttings and they will again line those tubes, different empty cylinders, and provision it with food and lay their eggs inside there. These guys are in West United States are actually such important pollinators of alfalfa fields that people have figured out a way to kind of manage them and put colonies of these guys out to help pollinate those fields. So they're a native bee. They're not as numerous as honeybees, but they're still just as important for certain crops. Another interesting bee is called a digger bee. And these guys, digger bee is kind of like a generic term for a lot of other bees that, for many different species of bees that will lay their eggs, or that will dig into the ground and make little tubes in the ground to lay their eggs. These guys can be, some are sweat bees, like this one on the right-hand side, which is a really metallic green type thing. They're called sweat bees because they actually prefer salty stuff as opposed to sweet things. So if you're really sweaty outside and they're around, they'll try to come and eat the sweat off of your body. Or they can be really fuzzy bees, like the guy on the left-hand side. They are solitary, but they tend to like company. So you can see from that upper picture how many of them are just digging little holes inside there. And of course, one female might dig a few holes, depending on how many eggs she's laying in that season. But by and large, it's usually 1 or 2 tubes per mother. So there's a lot of mothers that are over there. There's a lot of people that would say, well, they're harmful to the landscape, for the most part, because they do so good in other respects. We prefer to say, well, just learn to live and let live with these guys, because the benefit far outweighs the damage that they might be doing. And they really aren't going to do this in something like your turf. They're going to do it more in an uncultivated area. So, let them do what they're going to do. Carpenter bees are one, though, that could be considered definitely a pest. So these guys are very large. They're the same size about as a bumblebee. And the technical term for this, they have a hind end that, when I was in school, literally in grad school, we said they had a shiny hiney, as opposed to a bumblebee that has a really fuzzy butt right there. So carpenter bees have a shiny hiney. They are solitary as opposed to being social like a bumblebee is. And so they aren't going to sting you, but still I wouldn't grab it just in case. But they like to build their nests in stems and solid wood, and they will drill little holes in them. And in Texas, we like to use a lot of cedar posts for, ornamental or on our porches. And so they love to dig into that cedar. Maybe it's just like the right consistency for them to chew through. But they'll dig little holes in there, and so it can be kind of, not many people necessarily like it, and especially you don't like it if that's maybe your porch, or your railing on your porch, your deck, or it's on the eaves of your house. So they can cause quite a bit of damage. But here in Texas, we don't really consider them to be a truly structural pest. If you're from up north, or you do a little Google searching about them, you will find that in some places of the world, they're really considered damaging. But I think in Texas, we just have more things to worry about, and so these guys aren't really that big of a deal. I have this really cool video that I found. Carpenter bees do something very cool called buzz pollination. So they don't go pick up pollen. What they do is they shake their bodies really, really hard. And I know it's hard to see there, but what they're trying to show you by making that so dark is the pollen coming out of the plant. And so she's just vibrating, and that's how the pollen falls out. And I mean, she can't possibly be getting enough for herself. Maybe she's loosening it up so that she can eat some. But you know, that it's just kind of, I think that's just kind of a really cool thing that they do. These guys are also really good pollinators of veggies and many flowers. And in the Philippines, they've actually mass produced them for farm production. So we always know about honeybees being used on farms, but there are many other bees that can be utilized as well. Oops, let me go back. So these are just some pictures of some of those houses that you may or may not have seen. You can go online and find different ways to make these houses. These are mainly for solitary bees. So if you put them out in your yard, you can be pretty rest assured that they're not going to come after you and sting you unless you are trying to grab or do something to them first. They don't have a house to protect. There's some controversy, I guess you could call it, on whether these are actually beneficial for bees or more harmful for them. And in my opinion, and in the opinion of a lot of entomologists, it can't hurt. I mean, it's a house for them. You're providing somewhere for them to nest, and if much of their habitat is being destroyed, then how can this really be that harmful? But a lot of people that are like really hardcore naturalists don't like it because it's not as natural. So this one, someone's made themselves with some sort of tubing. You can roll anything up that you want. Plastic probably isn't the best for them. They probably won't come to it. Not that it's bad for them, but they like natural things, cellulose type material. So that's what they're going to be more attracted to. This picture on the left is one that Costco sells, and I put one of those out on my porch last summer, or I guess spring, and right away I started noticing that they were sealed up and that there were bees that had been laying their eggs in it. Some people will put chicken wire over the front of it, like you see on that right-hand picture, and that's to keep grackles or other birds from getting in there because they will peck through and take the babies out. But the key is to try to give them a variety of hole sizes and depths, and you want it to be at least 3 inches deep, if not a little deeper than that. Give them a variety of things so you get a variety of species that are attracted to it. If you keep it at just one size, then they may or may not come to it. And just kind of as a personal note, this one in the middle, I never got anybody to come to this middle size, but they were crammed all in these little tubes that were varying sizes. I also have no idea what butterfly would ever go inside of there, but they made it that way, so maybe someone told them it worked. There's also, actually, let me go back to that real quick. There's also really no data. It's all kind of personal, anecdotal evidence as far as what do you face it, north or south or east or west, how high up, how down, you know, where should you put these things? It really doesn't matter. Just place them wherever you want to place them and see what works for you. So it's a lot of trial and error because this is definitely a very new thing. You know, it was not, but like last year when people really started to utilize these things and you could find them commercially at different retail stores. So we're still learning about them. And then just really quickly, some of the things that you can do to encourage some of your pollinators in your garden is plant a pollinator garden. And what pollinators tend to like, as far as native pollinators, is they like flowers that are in clumps, as opposed to if you think of like a field of wildflowers or an agricultural crop area, it's just a broad expanse of one single thing. That's what honeybees like. That's what they're most attracted to. But if you want to bring in native bees and the other things that we'll talk about in addition to butterflies and moths, plant things in clumps. Plant things that are going to be blooming spring through the fall because most of these are going to go to bed and overwinter during the winter time. And most insects can see all wavelengths of light. Red, they really don't see very well at all. But what they see the very, very best is purple, blue, white, and yellow. So try to plant things in one of those color schemes. And I promise you that's what they're going to hone in on, and that's what they're definitely going to see. And then, of course, tomorrow, make sure you watch David because he's going to talk about things that are blooming 12 months out of the year and what you can put out so that you give them food 12 months out of the year. Other things that you should do, you know, just avoid pesticide use when bees are active. I always say if you've got a blooming plant, there is absolutely no reason for you to use a pesticide because it's not stressed out. It has no need to be sprayed with anything. So don't spray anything on things that are blooming, but also why are you spraying something on a plant that's blooming? If you have to apply a pesticide for some reason, Apply it before, when everybody's in bed. So before dawn, like, and really that's my least favorite time of the two options, or at sundown because everyone's gone back to bed and they're going to sleep. So if you wait until dusk or something, that's really the best time. That way it's dry, and when those bees come and are active at right after dawn, then you know that it's safe, it's dry, they shouldn't get into it very much. Water and mud sources are important, especially for those mason bees. And then just give them nesting habitats like the little bee houses or dead stumps or native grasses, and plant shrubby things that helps keep that soil really loose, as opposed to just only having a manicured lawn. If all you have is a lawn, you're not going to have a lot of pollinators that come in, but I think most people already know that. And really quickly, just a note about honeybees. I'm not going to talk about these guys because honeybees actually aren't native. There's no honeybee Apis mellifera, the species Apis mellifera, that's native to North America. They were introduced by the settlers, European settlers, in the 1600s, and so you can see now their range is all across pretty much the world. And I would argue that it probably goes further into Russia than that red kind of line shows. But the different colors in the very center are where they're really truly native to. And I think that splotch there in Africa is probably where the Africanized honeybee is found. And they're so aggressive that they don't allow other bees to come in. We, of course, have an Africanized hybrid of a honeybee. That's pretty much what our bees are. But we did not have bees here until 1600s or later. And actually, Native Americans called them the white man's fly because they knew that when they saw these honeybees on flowers, it meant that the white men were very close behind them because they would bring their colonies with them. So there's some cool history with honeybees also. But honeybees are definitely the most effective and efficient pollinators, and it's simply because their colony size is so gigantic. So they're just in sheer are able to pollinate tons and tons of things. And they need tons of food to feed their babies, so they're out there looking at plants all the time.
Summer, can you cut it down?
Pollen, of course, is for their babies, and nectar is for their carb, and that's what they store in the form of honey. Some people argue that if we got rid of honeybees, we would still have plenty of flowers, and we probably would still have plenty of flowers, and our regular landscape would look just fine because honeybees aren't really the best at pollinating those things. But what would be effective is our food production. We would really not be able to produce as much food as we do. We have honeybees to certainly thank for that. So both of these guys certainly native bees and honeybees play a really important role. A lot of people that are true naturalists really don't like honeybees. I'm a honeybee keeper. I love my honeybees, but I also really appreciate my native bees. I think that there's a role for each of these guys to play in the world. So I like planting things for both of these guys. There's also, beyond honeybees, there's other, or bees in general, there's other insects that are pollinators, and wasps are certainly one of those. Wasps are just kind of cool because they're kind of accidental pollinators. They're really, they go after the pollen and then they're accidentally getting it on their body and moving it from flower to flower, much like pretty much all insects are. Especially this time of year when those, especially the paper wasps and the other wasps are trying to build up their nests, they need a lot of pollen, and so they're getting that free and easy food. They are also predatory, so they have a lot of roles that are that they play in nature that are really great. Even yellow jackets, those really nasty little things that live in the ground and are really mean, even they are pollinators in a way. And then even that speckled wasp on the right-hand side, that guy, a lot of us call them like dirt daubers, mud daubers. One really cool wasp that we have in central, heck, I'd say they're probably all over Texas now, is this Mexican honey wasp. It's a little past the time to notice them up in the trees, but when the oak trees are pushing out all the old leaves to make room for the new leaves, and they go kind of semi-bald, you will look up and you'll see this giant sphere of, let me mute that. You'll see this giant sphere of a nest, and those are probably Mexican honey wasps. They are one of the few insects other than honeybees that actually produce honey. I've never tasted it personally. I've heard people say, oh, it's poisonous. They only go after, poisonous plants, but I don't know how they would know those are only poisonous plants. So I think that's just a fallacy. They look like, you can see the picture there. To me, they look like about the size of like a housefly. They're really not very big. And if you really look at that guy and you start watching your landscape, I think you'd be very surprised to realize how many of those guys are out there. Because they're all over the place and we just don't really notice them. And as long as they're above your head, leave that nest alone. Unless you're going to go up there and, cut out some limbs or something, they're probably never going to bother you, and you'll never bother them. And they'll do a couple things. They'll eat a lot of small insects out of your trees, but they'll also pollinate tons of things for you as well. That's the Mexican honey wasp. Paper wasps, of course, are also pollinators. They're really good at controlling caterpillars and other little small wormy type things out in your landscape, but they're also fabulous pollinators, and you'll see them on a number of plants. When they're pollinating on the flowers, for most of these things, even though they can sting you, if they're pollinating or they're feeding, they're foraging, they are totally uninterested in trying to sting you. They're a one-track mind kind of an animal, and so all they're trying to do is pick up the food. And so you can pretty much knock them or touch them or be out there messing with your landscape at the same time and space, and they're really going to pretty much ignore you. There are always exceptions to the rules. I know that. And some of you guys are saying, no, I've been stung and I didn't to bother them. But by and large, they ignore you as long as you're ignoring them, unless you're messing with that home, like on that top picture, unless you get near that. And then if you've ever gotten really close to one, and I don't suggest doing this because you never know what might happen, but it's like they all stop and turn and look at you, and they're trying to figure out when it's time to go ahead and attack. They're pretty amazing little animals, I think. Many other wasps. Those are the two big ones that we see in the landscape. But there are a number of beetles that are also good pollinators. And if you're out there taking a nature walk and you're seeing a lot of native plants, wildflowers and things that are blooming, take a look inside. They really tend to like those flowers that are like really bowl shaped and that have the stamen and the anther showing, the sex organs are showing. They're kind of attracted to that. They also like to get things that are open during the day, of course, and if they have a strong fruity smell to them, they're attracted to that as well. And you can see that one little beetle down there just packed full of pollen. What they're going after is the pollen in the plants, and right now they are crammed inside of these flowers. So soldier beetles are one of those. This one's on a goldenrod, so when you see goldenrod blooming, they will be covering those plants. And I get, or whatever time of year it is when the goldenrod decides to bloom, I'll get calls and pictures. Is this good? Is this bad? There's tons all over my goldenrod. And in this case, they're pollinating them. They're going after feeding on the pollen, and you can thank these guys for allowing you to have more blooms next year. The hermit flower beetle is a type of chafer, and there's a ton of these on native flowers right now. If you get looking around, I had someone send me a picture just the other day. They will you'll see 4 or 5 of them crammed inside of I'll find them in milkweed antelope horn, and I think that's what it's called. I'll also see them when your cactus blooms and those little yellow flowers, they'll be crammed inside there, but also in other places. So some people think they're maybe like a bee, but if they're not buzzing around, they're just stuck inside there. You've got yourself a little chafer that's in there. They will be covered in pollen, and you almost can't really tell what they are, and they almost look like a bee because they look like they're striped because they have so much on them. So keep a lookout for those. Soft-winged flower beetles are there's a lot of them. They look very different and unique, each one. But if you look at the pictures, they're pretty fuzzy. They have little hairs that are coming off of their body, and that's what makes them good pollinators. And they tend to like small, because they're a pretty small beetle, so they like much smaller flowers. There's something for everybody, and there's so many different varieties of shapes of flowers that they're that way for a reason, because there's a certain pollinator that is attracted to it. This tumbling flower beetle, I find these a lot of times on my lantana if I get looking close enough, but they're pretty teeny tiny little things. But if you notice, they have a lot of hairs or scales almost covering their body, and they've got Their wings don't cover their hind end. It almost looks like they have a stinger on the very end of it. But they can't hurt you. They're pretty harmless, but they're a cool little pollinator. You really have to open your eyes and look for these guys, though. And these two guys are an example of where they can be a pest in other situations, but in this situation, they're not. So on the left-hand side, I think they're both actually on goldenrod. On the left-hand side, that's a locust borer. And a locust borer, you wouldn't want it boring into your locust trees, or if you have furniture that's made of locust wood, of course, you wouldn't like that. But in this case, they're pollinating. And as long as you don't have locust trees around, they're probably not doing any damage. They're in this situation, they're considered beneficial. On the right-hand side is something called a blister beetle. And blister beetles can elicit a really nasty response in some people. And they will like, I don't react at all. I have a brother who gets this little clear pustule, and then I've known many people that will have a really intense reaction where it just really burns extremely badly. So it kind of just depends on your sensitivity to these guys. If they're found in hay, or if a horse consumes them, so if they're in like an alfalfa field or something, there's actually an equation for how much the horse weighs, how many of these guys they can consume before it will be fatal to the horse. So if they're found then, if you have horses around, you don't want these guys. But in this situation, they're pollinating. And the reason I say that is because I get a lot of emails. The two top questions are, and usually this is all I get, is what is it and is it bad? Well, it depends on the situation, right? So give me more details and I can give you a better idea of if it's a good guy or a bad guy. But in most cases, you can be good and you can be bad. It just depends on what's going on. There's a lot of flies that are also pollinators. My very favorite pollinating fly is called a syrphid fly, and some people call them flower flies. I try to give you 3 general examples of what these guys look like, and I've spoken about them many times before if you've been sitting in on these webinars. They're a beneficial insect that is it's almost like a robot. They could just kind of hover really fast and then they will zoom off. And that tends to be how a lot of flies fly. But these guys are like little drones, little robotic things. And they're usually the first pollinators I see and the last pollinators to go to bed once winter comes. So they're also predatory. Their larvae are really good predators, eating all sorts of bad stuff in your garden for you. And what will bring syrphid flies in is to allow your herbs to bolt. They love usually little tiny flowers. So if you have herbs outside, let that stuff bolt if you're able to. Let it flower. And that's one easy way early on in the year to bring syrphid flies into your landscape. And they just do a lot of good stuff. There's not always easy ways to bring good guys in. This is something you could definitely do to bring them into the garden, though. Even these little tachinid flies, some of them prefer to go after things that are sweet as opposed to things that are stinking and rotting. So flies can be gross, but they can also be important parts of nature as well. And if you look at them, they're fuzzy as they can be, right? They look like they have little mohawks or buzz cuts that have grown out too long. And when they look like that, that automatically tells me they've got to be a good pollinator. Bee flies are also really cool. They move like a syrphid fly. And I used to always say I'd never seen one. I saw my very first one yesterday in real life in the wild, not a dead one. And it was very exciting. It was, I don't remember if it was on bluebonnets, but it was in a patch where there were a bunch of bluebonnets and some other wildflowers. But when they fly, they've got this little point that sticks out from their mouth part, and they can't curl it back up like a butterfly can. So if you have really good eyes and you can catch them because they just kind of zoom off really fast, you see that thing sticking out, you know you've got a bee fly, and it resembles a bee. That's what I thought it was at first until I got to looking at it a little bit closer. So they're out there. They're just, a lot of these things are there. You have to open your eyes to actually know that you've got them. And there's even things that, putrid smelling flowers. What on earth would make those flowers decide that they want to smell putrid? Well, they're attracting certain insects like blowflies to them. But blowflies, they're also called bottleflies, are also really important pollinators of mango and avocados. I don't know why, but in this picture, I think it's so interesting because they think that flower is a dead body. And if you see those white specks everywhere, those are actually their eggs. So they've laid their eggs thinking this is a dead body they're laying their eggs on. And Mother Nature decided, I'm going to stink and bring in this bug because it's, I don't know. They have some symbiotic relationship that works for them. And then again, even things that we hate, you know, I think we could all probably argue this is probably the only insect in the world that we could get rid of and I'll probably be pretty happy about it. There's a lot of species of mosquitoes, not every single one bites us and sucks our blood, and definitely not every single one that even sucks our blood is a disease carrying mosquito or even has the ability to carry diseases. But they can be pollinators as well. So I say, when people say, what would happen if we got rid of mosquitoes? Well, there's certainly species we could do without, and then the other species will just take over and do what those guys couldn't do. But mosquitoes, when they emerge from the pupa case out of the water, they have to pick up nectar to have the carbs and the energy to find you or whatever animal it is that they suck blood from. And males don't suck blood at all. So those guys feed on nectar all the time. And so they're pollinating also, even though they're nasty little bugs that nobody likes. David is going to talk a lot more about pollinator plants, but I just wanted to give you guys some general ideas. And these are maybe more natural native plants that you might be interested in. The Xerces Society has a really good plant list. And the reason why I like this one better than other plant lists is because if you see on this kind of blue on the left-hand side, they have it broken down as to like early bloomers, late bloomers, like so that you have something that's going to be to pollinate. There, I think I've got y'all muted. You have something that will pollinate year round, or at least during the times when those insects need some food. Because what you don't want to do is encourage the insects to come in, and then they have food for them for a minute, and then you don't have food anymore for them. So I like this list. The one thing that I don't like about the list is, just like with all lists, they have to clump groups together. And so I think we're like in the Southern Plains region, I believe. So we're in there with Oklahoma. Well, certainly Oklahoma is has a totally different landscape than what we have, and we're not going to be able to grow certain things that they can, and vice versa. So do a little research and make sure that it grows well here before you really set yourself on a few of those plants. And then just like 3 really easy things that will bloom for a good chunk, if not all of those months when those guys are active. That any of those salvias, and the Henry Dulberg, I believe, is a native one, because I think the story is that somebody found it by Henry Dulberg's grave. But that guy, it is the first thing that's blooming in my landscape. And the bumblebees absolutely go bonkers over it. They love it, love it, love it. But other things will go after it as well. Greg's blue mist, there's also a white mist. That's also a really great pollinator plant, and it's also really good for butterflies as well as other pollinators. And it's pretty darn hardy. And then another really good hardy one is rosemary. And that, I guess, is actually the first thing that blooms. I like the rosemary because I don't have to take care of it very much, and I'm not that good at taking care of my plants. But it's the first thing that's blooming. I said that the salvia is, but this one's blooming like in February when it starts to warm up and we get a good rain. And it's food for my honeybees before there's any other food for them. So if you have a honeybee nest somewhere on your property, or you think in your neighborhood, plant that stuff, and that's definitely good food for those guys when there's no other options for them. And if you have the ability in your landscape to let wildflowers go, meaning let weeds flower, man, will you get a lot of beneficials and a lot of pollinators coming into your garden. I know that it's not always possible, right? But if you have the ability to do it, then it's certainly worth a try if you enjoy seeing pollinators coming around. What that butterfly is on, that black swallowtail, it's on that prairie verbena, which is a really good, I think it's a pretty flower. To me, it doesn't even look like a weed, but it's a really good one for butterflies and other pollinators. Don't forget tomorrow that David is going to do 12 months of nectar producing plants. The same time, 1 o'clock, I think tomorrow's the 9th, I believe, so I have the time right there. use the same link that you have for this one. We are recording this presentation and I have to edit it a little bit to make sure that it, it's not like 5 minutes in before I start talking. So it takes me a minute. But when I do that, you can find the link to this on our website, which is bear-tx.tamu.edu. And there's my email address if you guys have questions later on. I'm going to try to see, I know there's lots of stuff in the chat. I'm going to try to go through the chat and see if you guys have questions. Lots of things about, I can't see you. Hopefully it worked for y'all. And if y'all have questions, just click on that little, thing that looks like a talking bubble, like from a cartoon, and you can type in a question. What is the name of the bee that is a huge bumblebee but all black? I call them Batman bees. Oh, you know what? That's a really good question. It's most likely, so the question is, what's the name of the bee that's a huge bumblebee but it's completely black? It's probably a robber fly, which is actually they feed on bumblebees. And last year I had robber flies all over the place. I had one robber fly that would sit on this fig tree, and next to it was this bush that blooms all the time. And the bumblebees were all over that thing all the time. And that robber fly would sit. And every time I went outside, he was catching one and eating it. So he ate a ton. They're not, I eventually got to the point where I knocked him down and I had to squish him because I was sick of sharing all my bumblebees with him. But you probably got a robber fly there. People helping in the chat. Does this leaf cutting bees cut other flowers of other flower plants? They just cut leaves of anything, but they leaf cutter bees tend to prefer roses first. So if you have that in your landscape, that's what they're going after first and foremost. But I've seen them on anything, crepe myrtles, pretty much anything. They're just trying to get a little that little kind of cutout. They don't really care what it is. Let's see. I've read that we need to clean out a bee house each year. Do you feel that's necessary? So if it's totally full, when it starts to totally fill up, I would, but in my experience, like, 20% at the very most is all that they fill in. So if that's the case, I might wait a little bit. You can just buy replacements, and the best time to replace them is kind of right now. You watch them really carefully and you see that they've opened up and they've emerged. Now get in there and clean them out really well, because what you don't want to do is clean them out when they've started laying eggs. But this is a good time to really be watching closely. And once they've emerged and that little sealed up cap has opened up, get in there and clean it out. I wouldn't use like soap and water. I would just kind of bang it out a little bit. And I think probably more than anything, you have to just buy the little replacement tubes. If you don't harvest and clean the cocoon, okay, someone answered that also. How do you clean bee houses? I just take like a stick or something. I just kind of clean it out. It's not sticky necessarily in there. There just is like mud from where they've made little rooms. Can you get a copy of this presentation? Yes, if you email me, I can make a PDF version of it. Actually, probably what I'll do to save myself from answering millions of emails, I will post the presentation on our website. So just give me a few days to get that done, because the editing is really tedious and I get mad and then I have to give it a rest. Forgive me if I miss y'all. Syrphid flies love goldenrod. Tons of stuff loves goldenrod. Let's see. People just talking. How do you clean a solitary bee house? We answered that. What bug category do fireflies fall under? Are they good or bad? They're neutral. They're not really necessarily good or bad. Okay, I have red, white, blue, and purple bluebonnets. I noticed that the bees and even wasps won't land on the white bluebonnets. They will land on the others, but not with the white blooms. Why could that be? I have no idea why that might be. They should be able to see it. Maybe, with bluebonnets, when the little white part turns purpley, at least it's purpley to me, that tells you that it's pollinated. So maybe they can't really hone in and figure out that that plant needs to be pollinated. I read that bees use pollen on crepe myrtle blooms for food for themselves and not for making honey. Is that true? Are any other reasons they would use crepe myrtle pollen? So crepe myrtles do not have nectar. You can't make honey out of pollen. So it is true that they only go after the crepe myrtle for the pollen because that's all that they can provide them. But they do not make honey out of pollen. So pollen is bee bread is what they turn it into. So it is food for them. We experienced a huge swarm of bees on one of our hummingbird feeders. Any thoughts? They're hungry. They're hungry and they're starving, and that was free and easy food. If you don't like the bees, don't put out the hummingbird feeders for a while until the bees get their fill, or leave it out, let the bees get their fill and then refill it later. They will coexist. The hummingbirds will avoid it and they will come back. You're not going to lose your hummingbirds if you let the bees have some food. They're both pollinators. In my opinion, bees are better pollinators. So my answer is always leave it for the bees. How would native Indians pollinate their crops in North America? With native bees that were already here. One of the early bumblebee charts showed a huge increase in numbers in the early 50s and then a decline ever since. Why? I have no idea why. To be quite honest, I bet you it's because in the 50s they were probably doing a better job at monitoring for them. And prior to that, they probably didn't have the detection tools or techniques that maybe we have now. Okay, sorry, I guess I missed a question. Does neem oil hurt pollinators? You know what? Anything that is considered a pesticide or an insecticide will hurt a pollinator, absolutely. So if you get neem oil or any other organic pesticide on a pollinator, you will certainly kill it. So leave paper wasp alone or just try to take care of the nest when, I'm assuming when it's close to the building. You know what, if your comfort in your life is more important than that wasp, so if they are on your porch and they're bothering you all the time, get rid of it. That doesn't bother me. If they don't bother you, they're doing some good. So leave them alone, but that's certainly a personal preference. Wouldn't they need to eat the neem to do harm? No, they just need to touch it. That's what neem oil is, an oil, and it's a contact insecticide. They don't consume it to get sick unless you're using it as like unless you're using it as a drench and as a systemic. But even diatomaceous earth will kill your beneficial insects. Sunflower bees by iNaturalist. I don't know. All right. I am going to go ahead and stop recording.